Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of Conversations on Anares. My name is Joseph Orozco. I'm the co-director of the Anares Project for Alternative Futures. The Anares Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that try to imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and empire. And part of our project involves conversations with artists, organizers, and scholars who are interested in pursuing how to bring about this kind of future that we are dedicated to. My guest today is someone who is helping us to think about the possibilities of radical democracy in the United States. There's been a lot of talk about the health of the U.S. American democracy in the past year. Surveys early in 2024 indicated that a majority of Americans believe that our political system is broken, and there's very little public trust in major institutions such as the presidency, Congress, and even less so for the Supreme Court. Before November 2024, many voters indicated that they believe that the election of Donald Trump to the president was a threat to this democracy. Yet, millions of voters chose not to participate in the contest at all, and Donald Trump won a plurality of voters to become president. Now, in the last week or so, in January 2025, we have seen Trump issue a flurry of executive orders ending DEI programs throughout the federal government, ordering immigration crackdowns, and ending care for transgender youth, prisoners, and military personnel. Support for many of these measures is mixed, except unfortunately for ending transgender care for youth. A lot of the surveys indicate that an overwhelming majority of Americans support these kinds of measures. So, what are we to make of all of these conflicting snapshots? My guest today has written an article that tells us we need to upend many of our assumptions about the United States as a democratic society. He says we need to consider more carefully our history and to ponder the possibilities of radical democracy in our everyday lives. My guest today is Andrew Lee. Andrew Lee is an organizer in Philadelphia, and he's the author, most recently, of Defying Displacement: Urban Recomposition and Social War from AK Press. He recently wrote this pamphlet for the Lexicon series from the Institute of Anarchist Studies entitled Democracy Beyond the State, which is what I want to talk about with Andrew today. Andrew, thanks a lot for being here on the program with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So before we get to talk about your article, Democracy Beyond the State, I was hoping if you could explain a little bit about what the Institute for Anarchist Studies is, of which you are a board member, and what the Lexicon series of pamphlets is about that's part of the IAS.
Absolutely. So I'm a member of the Institute for Anarchist Studies, as is Joseph, and the IAS provides grants to writers, translators, and media makers who are engaging with anarchist ideas or practices. So the IAS publishes the Perspectives on Anarchist Theory journal and co-publishes books with AK Press, including Octavia's Brood, edited by William Marisha and Adrienne Murray Brown, Harsha Walia's Undoing Border Imperialism, and most recently, my book on militant struggles for land defense and against gentrification, Defying Displacement. And so, one of the things that the IAS has done that I've been a fan of for a very long time is the Lexicon's pamphlet series, which first came out around the time of Occupy Wall Street as a series of short, free, super accessible zines breaking down concepts like gender, anarchism, white supremacy. And I remember people passing them around at Occupy encampments like as organizing tools, as ways to build shared understandings for political action. And I remember thinking like that's what we have to be doing. Like if quote unquote radical writing, I think, has any inherent value and self crit, jury might still be out on that one. I think it's as things like that, right? Not ways to gatekeep or to demonstrate like intellectual or academic authority, but actually to do the very opposite as ways to like break down obstacles to developing a common language for collective resistance. Yeah, so democracy beyond the state, like all of the other um, lexicon editions, is available for free at anarchiststudies.org right now. We're hoping to get it formatted so you can print it anywhere and make copies. Um, and all of the other issues um, are available to print right now. So I really encourage folks to look at the whole series and see if there are things that could be useful for the community work that you might be doing with folks today.
Great, thanks. We'll try to put a link on that into our program notes for folks to be able to take a look at. But I think one of the striking things about your pamphlet, the article that you've written for it, is just how timely it was in sort of grappling with all these issues, all these sort of conflicting questions about what U.S. democracy is, never was, could possibly be. Um, you wrote this particular pamphlet, "Democracy Beyond the State," in before the election in November of 2024. I was wondering what was going through your mind that was motivating you to decide that you needed to write some kind of a analysis to help people think about going into this election season. Why did you think that we needed to examine the radical origins of democratic practices?
Yeah. Um, this is something I've wanted to write for a really long time, sort of like for a few election cycles now. And so this time I thought I just have to do it this time. Because I think like democracy is such an interesting term in that, yeah, democratic practices simultaneously have radical and like deeply authoritarian origins because democracy is said to mean a whole range of things, right? There's scarcely a national government or political ideology that won't tell its adherents that what it is doing is real democracy, and what everyone else is doing is like a worse, deficient form of democracy, right? In the US, that means the political the particular features of the US political system are what actual democracy looks like. And Canada, Mexico, Honduras, the UK are all following like worse, deficient forms of democratic practice. Right? The Nazis said that they were democratic. Marxist Leninists say that they were democratic. Everyone actually says, when you really think about what democracy is the thing that we do, and no one else does. Um, and so democracy is used as like this master narrative so broadly. I think it really risks becoming an empty signifier with virtually no positive content because there's no way to judge between all these competing claims about what democracy actually is. And they all kind of sound plausible within their own frameworks, right? The Soviet Union would say, well, we have real democracy because our state governs in the interests of workers and peasants, who are the overwhelming majority of people in the Soviet Union and around the world. And it's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. And in the US, it's like, well, we're a democracy because we have multi party competitive elections. And that means if you have different thoughts, you can vote, and whoever gets the most votes kind of wins. And it's like, yeah, that also seems kind of true. Um, we use democracy so broadly. I think there are anti authoritarian radical folks who make reasonable arguments for jettisoning the concept entirely, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to excavate a concept of democracy that might be useful for our revolutionary movements, which is why I'm so excited it got to find a life as part of the lexicon series. And because in the US, like other capitalist representative democracies, we think of democracy as like a thing that's produced by multi-party elections. Of course, it's front of mind every 4 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, so part of your work is right is sort of taking on the idea that democracy is only about what happens in what we broadly would call electoral politics, and to sort of think about broader sort of economic, social, cultural, political values apart from the state in all of this kind of work. You begin by talking about how like the meaning of democracy, what exactly are the features of a democratic society? Is it just about those features in the electoral system, or is it some other kind of thing? And you mentioned at the beginning, like you were just saying now, right, that the marker often for us in the United States of a healthy democracy is this idea of um, uh, multi-party or at least duopoly in the United States case, right? Elections, but you begin sort of provocatively by saying, "Look, um, we promote democracy. We take this as sort of like our identity in the United States as part of the national project of the United States, but." This society really has never been a democratic one from the start. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that in terms of the sort of the false promotion of ourselves as a democratic society. Like what exactly is preventing the US from being able to claim itself as a democratic society from its very foundation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about American political culture is that there's this tendency to have this like narrative of like a fall from glory, which I mean, it's of course particularly pronounced on the right, but I think even left liberal people fall into this, where it's like, everything that Donald Trump does is like really bad and has no antecedents. And in my parents' America, they wouldn't do this, right? It's like they were spraying Mexican day laborers with Zyklon B at the border. Like, of course they would do this. You know what I mean? Um, it's like where is this golden age before things got bad and corrupt and either too totalitarian or too woke, depending on your party preferences. Um, and Yes, I think that's something that sort of like because of like the understanding that we get in like the American education system and American society of this understanding of democracy as the biggest good, like the most important thing, and the way you get democracy being through elections, and the way you know that elections are good is because they're constitutional. It does set up this like golden age of democracy when the Constitution was being drafted by some of the worst people in colonial British North America, right? Like some real monsters amongst them, setting this system up. All of whom explicitly hated the idea of democracy, which had gotten a bad rap throughout the like Western political tradition since it started, right? Um, I think it's really important that we look at the American system as it is. And it doesn't mean we aren't minimizing the horrifying things that are happening in the present day to say that they are of a kind with horrible things that have happened historically throughout the American project. In fact, it gives us a more solid grounding to actually grapple with them, and to see what social institutions and forces are supporting and supported by them. Um, like the US has always been designed to be a white majority nation with white rule. Like that is how the borders of the electorate have been defined. That's what determined immigration policy explicitly until very recently. And as soon as there was the threat that that would no longer be the case, now we see the kind of like virulent white racial xenophobia that's powering everything that the Trump administration is doing now. But that's not aberrational. Like the novel thing would be if the U.S. were a white minority nation. That's never happened before, and it's not because white people have always been the majority of people in this section of North America, right? That's what the American project is, right? It's the government for those people, right? It's settler democracy, just like in Israel. So I think we need to be really careful in painting it. We need to be real. We need to have a really sober view of what the American project actually has been historically from its founding to the present day. Um, and I think that like the American state has changed dramatically since the 18th century in its capacities, in its nature, in its relationship to state government, in all kinds of shit, right? So the idea of there being a coherent, quote unquote, democratic tradition just because people are appealing to the same constitutional document is kind of absurd to me. Like
Mm.
that doesn't actually make sense. Like, did George Washington want there to be NASA? Think about it, y'all. Like, like, um, I promise I'm
Yeah,
not like a constitutionalist libertarian, but like, of course he fucking didn't.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
um, but there are also things that have stayed the same, right? So, like, what
Mm.
we're left with today are the institutions and the social norms and the political culture of things like several centuries of white white rule in a multiracial, arguably plurinational context, right?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, now it has this like exceptionally overt, explicit character. Um, but I think that the danger if we don't understand this is we start protesting against the worst abuses at the current moment, but then remaining satisfied when it reverts back to what we think of as normal. Biden kicked out more migrants than Trump did in his first term. Obama deported more people than Trump did in his
Mm.
first term. That's the normalcy that a lot of people were content with returning to. And that's horrifying. That's like, that's a moral catastrophe. Um, that's using flesh and blood human beings as a partisan tool for electoral turnout, consciously
Mm.
or unconsciously, at the behest of the party that did do those larger numbers of deportations.
Yeah, yeah.
So we need to see that there are the assumption that we can revert back to a norm of democratic power is, I think, deeply corrosive to building the kind of sustained, militant, multi generational, oppositional social movements that we need to build to actually win popular power.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that I mean, I think that there's a growing kind of sense that there's parts of the institutional makeup of our state that don't make a lot of sense. A lot of people questioning the purpose of the Electoral College, the power of the Senate, right? All these kinds of designs that were originally part of, you know, holding down popular power in a variety of different kinds of ways. And, I think back to, the election in 2016, where I saw a lot of, liberal minded folks just, wandering around my university, I saw so many of my colleagues, on the day after election, primarily my white colleagues, in the hallways, literally crying, saying, "Oh my gosh, we've swerved so far away from American values with this election of President Trump in the first term. We're moving away from." What it means to be an American. And I always think back that, one of the very first acts that the first Congress of the United States passed was this immigration law, right, in 1789, that explicitly said if you want to immigrate to the United States and to become a US citizen, you have to be a white person. So that racial qualification, right, being a white person in order to become a United States citizen, was there from the very beginning, right, of the US state. It was part of that vision of who this place was for and who could be part of the project. And those qualifications never really left until the middle of the 20th century. So for most of its history, right, the federal immigration law, right, had this explicit sort of criteria that, right, whiteness is deeply part of what it means to be a U.S. citizen. And we've only been able to move away from that in the past, say, 60 or so years. And so to say that somehow, right, the idea of us not being a white settler nation and that we're somehow moving back to, we're swerving away from a sort of a more golden age. All of that is political rhetoric, not grounded in any kind of history or awareness of what all of this is supposed to be about. The backlash that we're seeing now from the right seems to be really a backlash to meager sort of gains that have only really come out since the late 1960s and 70s. So, yeah, I think that there's something really kind of odd about the weird historical either amnesia or just ignorance of how the U.S. state works to tamp down popular movements, and the sort of notion of who belongs here and who can be part of this project. We've never been a particularly inclusive society.
Right. Um, yeah, I saw the 2016 election results come in with an undocumented friend and his three kids, and he didn't cry. So if I saw white tenured professional class workers with citizenship crying after the election, I would be writing my further and any further lexicon pieces that I author from prison because that's crazy. But I know what you mean. Like, yeah, people. It's the people with the who have nothing to lose who get to be theatrical about it, right? People who are actually at risk are like trying to take care of business and not lose their mind and like make sure their families are safe, make sure that they are safe, make sure that like the people who are like doing theatrical shows of despair. It's like where were you during the Obama deportations, right? Where were you during the war in the last five countries? The military actions during Democratic administrations. Like, what is this actually about, right? Because there's this undercurrent of state racial violence and like non-state racial violence is like kind of a theme of American history. But we also another theme of American history is like the waspy social norms of like not being seen as uncouth. And I think apologies to your sobbing coworkers, but like I think that's part of it. I think part of it is like if the president can carpet bomb Libya but like give a nice UN speech about it, like who knows? It's hard to say what the truth is. Um, but if they're being a buffoon, if they're being like embarrassing, if they're saying the quiet part out loud, then that's objectionable. Um, which I think ultimately is about like an identification with the US state, right? Like, I'm not embarrassed by the things that Donald Trump says because I don't expect it to be represented by the president of the American empire. I think the things he says are concerning. I think the things he does are concerning. I think the things that Obama and Biden did were concerning in different ways too, and that's the context in which we're doing political organizing. But I'm not like, oh, this looks so bad on me. Like when I'm talking to comrades in other countries, they're probably going to think the same thing about me insofar as I'm an American, regardless of who the president is, if they're like politically engaged folks. And like they aren't going to think the best things because we take all the super profits and it's bad. You know what I mean? Like, but I'm not like, oh, now I'm going to like look bad when I'm like on vacation in Italy or wherever. You know what I mean? Like that's the government wasn't there for me. It particularly wasn't there for a lot of the people in my community who I care deeply about. It has only ever been something against them. So like political institutions doing like unguarded authoritarian actions without remorse is of course bad, but the plummeting faith in political institutions in the United States, um, the Supreme Court, the Congress, presidency, your mayor, whomever, I think that's good. I think that's great. I think that should be what we want. I think we want people to have a political analysis grounded in reality, grounded in how these institutions actually work and whose interests they actually serve. And for a lot of people who are not the beneficiaries of their policies, like you should have very low faith in these people. You should have very low faith in these institutions. You should have very low faith in getting a better reform candidate in these institutions and them not turning into the same kind of asshole in 2 election cycles because we have no empirical evidence to suggest that anything else would happen. So, totally honestly, like a decline in the legitimacy of American institutions is good. A decline in uh, the global legitimacy of the American state is good. And the price is immense because the reason these things are happening are because of horrors, abject horrors, like the genocide in Gaza,
Mm.
like the gender totalitarianism being deployed across the country, like the threat of mass deportations, and the practice of mass deportations, right? These aren't things to celebrate, but if they aren't just going to be unmitigated horrors, the only way to salvage anything of value from these incredible acts of violence is to use them, to fight them, to resist them, to oppose them, but also to use them to attack the foundations of legitimacy for the system that created them.
Yeah, that's what I like about what your work is about. Is that I mean, because a lot of what you're trying to do is to confront the kinds of stories, the narratives, the attitudes that lead people to be complacent about this kind of stuff. But a lot of the sort of voters who in 2020 were saying, oh, as long as we can get Trump out, we can get back to normalcy and things will be okay. That it's all about an election cycle like this, without looking like the sort of radical foundations of the violence of the American state. You sort of take a look at this kind of history of a certain story, at least, of U.S. history that says, look, we were democratic at the very beginning, and in fact, we started to. There were some problems, a little bit of problems with slavery here, but we fixed it right through Civil War Reconstruction, and then the Civil Rights Movement came along, and we really fixed a lot of things there, and that we really come a long way, and we should celebrate those kinds of accomplishments in that sense because we have made society way much better and much more democratic and much more inclusive than it was right in 1789 or whatever. Some of that is true, but what you're sort of saying in your pamphlet is that we shouldn't take a lot of comfort in some of these sort of measures because there's still a lot of problems that and enormous violence that we see in the world today that are the result of the particular setup of our political institutions today. Things have gotten a little bit better here, but we should not be sort of thinking that people have an effective voice in our societies today, and that you want to confront that kind of story. Um, if someone would come to you and say, Andrew, I just don't understand it. We're so much better now than we ever were in the beginning, and even since the 1960s. Like, how can you talk about like why we aren't, a bastion of social justice? What would you say to that person?
Yeah, I think that perhaps the most germane example is the civil rights movement, because there was such a measurable change, and it happened within like relatively recent historic memory, right? If like I don't remember it, but like my parents or my grandparents would have, right? Like I know someone, I've spoken to folks who lived in pre-civil rights America, whereas as opposed to things um, like the emancipation, right? And like yeah, there were in like half the country, black people couldn't vote because of literacy tests, because of poll tax, because all these like very explicit pointed things to keep people from voting. And now black voters are like one of the major blocks within one of the two major parties. Um, so that is a huge change, right? That is of course significant. My question is, was the civil rights movement about expanding voting rights? And the immediate answer is like, well, of course it is, right? And yet, yes, of course, there were large sections, perhaps the majority of the Black freedom struggle of the 1950s and 1960s that was focused on ending electoral disenfranchisement of Black people. Um, but why was that? Right? Was it that people were really enamored of the idea of like going inside voting booths? Like, God, that seems like such a great time that folks are having. Is it because people were somehow duped into thinking that America had some great uh, democratic potential, or that the American values were particularly good, or American government was really redeemable and good at its core when they had lived all of their lives, and their parents' lives, their grandparents' lives under white minority rule in the Jim Crow South? Was it because that made them patriots? No, of course not. Um, of course, people were fighting for voting rights as an instrumental goal, as a way to achieve something else, as a mechanism by which oppressed and disenfranchised Black communities could achieve and exercise political power, of course. So ending racist voting laws was a tool to win popular power in the Black communities that had been denied it. So that's how we measure the achievements, right? Not whether they got the tool, but whether they were allowed to use that tool effectively. So, and I think that's like especially pertinent in the wake of the George Floyd rebellion. And the major cities where that movement was the most strong and militant, many of those cities had Black ruling elites in government for decades. For decades. And what did those thoroughly diversified ruling elites do with the power that they won, with the positions they were given by the struggles of people fighting and marching and dying in the Black freedom struggle? In these cities, um, are there no longer Black, brown, and immigrant hyper exploited, over policed underclasses? Um, if the electoral franchise gave communities of color political power, are our communities voting for our gentrification today? Are we voting for our displacement? Are we voting for our incarceration? Is that what we're expressing democratically at the polls in these majority minority cities that are still being run for the benefit of a not exclusively what predominantly white elite, right? That's the question. Because a lot of the people in the civil rights movement thought very deeply about these questions. Like in Dr. King's writing, he engages, I think, deeply with this question in a way far more profound than I want to be able to vote. I want people to be able to vote more because that was never the problematic for people. Um, so we need to take that struggle seriously on its own terms and think like if that had been enough, why was there an LA uprising? Why was there the George Floyd movement? Why were there any of these things? Um, if this was sufficient, because again, the in its superficial goals, it was entirely successful. So we need to ask the question: why did gaining the electoral franchise not lead to the achievement of popular political power for communities of color?
Yeah, I like that question. I
Um,
mean, I want to ask that question. This is part of what you sort of set up in the pamphlet, right? Is that there's I like the metaphor that you use. Is that there was, a lot of accomplishment in acquiring the tools, but the tools within this particular system, as we've seen, haven't really led to widespread, quality of life changes for people. A lot of people still disenfranchised, oppressed, immiserated in various ways. Uh, but the franchise is opened up. I mean, why isn't voting effective?
I mean, I don't think voting is. I mean, I think voting is very effective. I just don't think voting does the thing that people think that it does. Um, like there's a 2014 study that found that quote economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. governmental policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence. Right? Basically, like groups of people who aren't loaded, there you can't measure any impact that they have individually or collectively on the actual policies that get passed. Right? So is that like a big whoopsie daisy on the American political system, right? Because it seems to be working great for the people with the most social power, right? It doesn't actually seem to be a problem for them. Like, let's imagine that I'm a legislator, a politician of some sort with political power in the US. And like, I'm really just trying to know what the right thing to do is. And like businesses can lobby me, and like citizens groups and unions, nonprofits can lobby me, and some of them I'll listen to, some of them I won't. If you're just like a random person on the street, I absolutely probably will not. Like I'm trying to figure out what people. I'm trying to get information from the electorate about what they want. I think that's generally how we think of elections in the US. They're a way for us collectively to like give information to the state about what we want, and the state uses that information to craft policies, and that makes those policies democratic. Um, why would the state use elections to do that? Like in a two-party system, it's like a binary yes no or stay home. Like that's a terrible way to get information, which is why there's polling, which is why there's focus groups, which is why there's like if people care, um, even in the utopian vision where politicians aren't trying to like set the narrative, set the message, convince us to support the things that are beneficial for them or necessary for the system to keep functioning. Like even if they are just really trying, doing their darndest to figure out what the American voter wants them to do, why would they use two-party elections to do that? And of course they don't, right? Of course they don't. Um, so I mean, I just think that there's a lot of like ideological baggage around this in the US. And I think, I think part of it is just like national chauvinism to some extent, to be honest. Like every country tells its citizens that it has the best political system, right? Like if you're in North Korea, you're like, if you don't have a party representing the Korean worker and peasant masses, like, how could that be democratic? You want to be U.S. client state? Like, this is the only form of democracy possible. And you just hear your whole life and you're like, yeah, of course, right? If you grow up in Lebanon, you're like, if you don't have a multi confessional system balancing the interests of religious communities, how could it be called democracy? And you're like, yeah, totally, man. Absolutely. The only thing is because in the US, just because of the amount of American imperial power, right? Most folks don't speak other languages. Most folks don't have any like real contact with folks um, from other political systems. And the propaganda is just so good that even people who think of themselves as dissidents or radicals, we really got to sit down and think and like try to excavate some of this like these narratives because they just become so yeah like common sense, like the American ruling class common sense, right? Is yeah like of course of course it's representation. Of course I'm represented by the political system. um I think of like the run up to the invasion of Iraq, which saw the largest protest movement in U.S. history, um, and didn't do shit because they really wanted to support Iraq. Um, I think the Palestine solidarity movement is, of course, wildly important, and I wish that more needs to be done until folks win, right? Until this situation is over. Um, and like, there will never be a president who says free Palestine.
No, no.
Uh,
Well, this is something that you say in the pamphlet I find really interesting now that you're talking about this. I mean that yeah, there's this kind of ideological sort of narrative that has seeped into even kind of liberal progressive spaces, right? That voting and getting the message out to policymakers is the right route for our energy. And you in the pamphlet you say, this narrative has really come under scrutiny in the past, let's say 30 years or so, because you start mentioning like criticisms that are raised by the Zapatista movement in Mexico in 1994, that like the state doesn't represent us, it can't possibly contain us, right? The world. It's not a world that can sort of actually take in the information that we Zapatistas are trying to put out into the world about our lives. You also then sort of bring this up into like Occupy, that there were practices within Occupy Wall Street that indicated that people were fed up with the idea of liberal representative democracy as being ineffective, as not representing the voices of people. So it seems that part of what you're saying is that we're starting to see, at least building in the past 30 years, these kinds of movements that are questioning whether or not there is democratic space within the American political system. If we think about democratic as spaces for people, ordinary people, to flex power to get themselves represented in their well-being, we're starting to see movements that speak about or that talk about kind of these radical democratic practices within them. Could you say a little bit about that? Like, how should we be paying attention to and learning from recent social movements in terms of what democracy means?
Yeah, I think something that US social movements are among the worst in the world at is um, engaging with elected officials in a realistic way. I think that, like, look, sometimes the mayor's going to make a decision, and you want him to make a certain decision, and you end up trying to push them to do something, right? I don't think that's the end of the world. But I think that there's like a principled and a non-principled way to do that. Um, like in organizing against displacement, we just won a provisional victory here in Philly to stop our Chinatown from getting turned into not even a basketball arena, but like the parking lots and hotels outside a inconveniently located downtown basketball arena because we live in hell. I think, um, I mean, there are also a lot of like corporate shenanigans behind this deal, this cancellation as well, because again, we live in hell. But I mean, I think that there is a tendency um, for folks, especially folks trained, but not exclusively, but especially folks trained in like nonprofit, like 501c4 organizing spaces, to be like, if the politician does the bad thing, they are the worst and the heir to centuries of oppressive, racist violence, whatever. But if they don't do it, everything's cool. Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. Everything's fine. I'm cool with my landlord. I'm cool with the cops. I love my shift supervisor. I'm living on like everything's good now. Um, and I think that even a lot of folks who are more radical um, are doing like quote unquote base building or whatever, end up talking like that because of a lack of faith in other people's, I don't know, analysis, intellectual abilities, whatever. Um, I think that's bad because it's condescending shit. But I also think it's bad because it limits the kind of organizing we can do because we can't have like real conversations. And I mean, I think that there's like the way is there's also a way to like engage with the reality of these structures that isn't opportunistic, right? That actually is true to our analysis and actually helps build with people instead of like manipulating them. I think it's like if the mayor does the bad thing, it's like, yes, you are the heir to centuries of oppressive shit. And no one wanted you to do this, and you did it anyway. And this shows who you really serve and who people in your position have always and will always necessarily serve. What can we do about that? What do we do next? How can we undermine their power in different ways? How can we build other structures ourselves? If they do the good thing, if they do if they make the right decision, if they do the thing we ask them to do and we don't want to hit them hard because then why would they ever do anything for us again? And they don't do the gentrification mega project. We say, oh my God, thank you so much. That's great. You did the thing we wanted you to do. You stopped the gentrification mega project. It really makes me think that if y'all on the city council have the capacity to vote against gentrification mega projects, what have y'all been doing for the last 50 years? What did you do when there was university expansion? What were you doing when they put that freeway in? Why did you let them build that new business district? We're just asking questions here. Now that we know you can do this, again, thank you so much. We will demand nothing less forever. Because are the people in that other community less valuable than us? Right? Um, I think like there's I think we should have a great degree of cynicism and um like just like reality checks when we're dealing with these institutions, right? I'm not someone to be like, oh, if you ever try to force someone in power to do something, you're a reformist. You can only like break windows and eat shitty vegan food at potlucks, or you aren't a real anarchist, right? No offense to anyone who breaks windows and eats shitty vegan food. But you know what I mean? Like, I mean, that ultimately, right? Unless we're building, we aren't a threat to the system, right? We're a subculture. And I think it's natural that the first place for a lot of people who are trying to build with politically is like, yeah, like why don't you go to the people who make democratic decisions? Like, I think that's natural, right? I don't think it means like, oh, you're like a moron, you're like a stupid reformist liberal. It's like, of course, we are all trained to think that, right? And if we leave that field entirely, I think people have like a reasonable fear. Well, then it's just going to be the cops or the developers or whatever at the council meetings, and they'll use that as an excuse to steamroll us even faster, right? So like I get people feeling like we need to engage with the process, but I don't want the only two options to be like I only smash windows and eat vegan burritos, or like I'm thanking the fucking mayor for only ethnic cleansing 7 out of 8 times. You know what I mean? Like we need to be charting a course. I think especially with all the right wing bullshit that's happening now, that is suspicious and in opposition to the Trump agenda, and all of the preceding Democrats who gave him all the tools that he's using now against our communities. And like, there is a way to build with folks and meet them where they're at and not cosplay as a fucking voter, and not purport to believe things that we know aren't true, aren't effective, and aren't going to help us actually win.
Yeah, so I like this, and I mean, part of this is the way that you end your pamphlet by saying that one of these lessons is learning how to sort of harness the real meaning of democracy, or a term that comes out of social movements, right? Democracy in real terms, you put it, right? That there's a tradition that has been evolving, then you're starting to see elements of it in recent social movements. That's not about just sort of engaging with these politicians in this kind of way, but it's its own tradition about thinking about how to build democracies in our grassroots communities, within our activist spaces. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this idea of democracy in real terms, like what does that mean? What is this tradition? And why is that tradition, this new radical tradition you're talking about, why do you think it's such a break with that kind of ideological position that, what we really should be doing is trying to like get the mayor to like not vote for this gentrification project? Like, what's this more radical
Yeah,
tradition of democracy in real terms that you want to sort of support for us to think about?
yeah. I mean, I think because in the American political culture and educational system, we're raised with this like procedural idea of democracy I mentioned earlier, where the idea that it's like voting is the thing that makes democracy. There's like a thing you do and then it makes democracy. Just like in the USSR, it was like class standpoint. Like class standpoint is the thing that makes proletarian democracy, right? Because we have this like processional understanding of what democracy is. I think even on the radical left, people can get caught up in this shit of like, if we just design the perfect meeting, it will be democratic. Um, it always amazes me when like anarchists are like, we got to have more meetings. Like after we overthrow the government, it'll be like all meetings with like federated meetings. Like I'll have like my workplace council and my neighborhood council, and they'll be federated up to the international level. And any economic decision of any time of any sort will be like done by consensus through meetings. And like our life will be 90% meetings, and that will be freedom. I'm like my siblings in Christ. I have sat through an anarchist meeting in my life. Why would I want my life to be only that? That's terrible. I might get canceled for this, but like Jesus fucking Christ, what a nightmare. Um, like it's just like occupy general assemblies forever. That's terrible. Like that's not a world I want to fight for. Like, don't get me wrong, the state and capitalism are bad, but that's also bad. And I think, to be honest, like meetings are classed and racialized and gendered, and there's like a lot of these people. I think it's because of like student organizing is one of the few places that like radical ideas are allowed to circulate with like a big asterisk at the end, right? After the defeat of the non-university sections of the liberation movement of the '60s, right? Um, that it's people whose day jobs are meetings or in the form of meetings. There's like agendas, there's like points of order, there's like someone takes notes, and then you're trying to like organize some radical shit on the weekend. But because our political imaginations are shaped by the society in which we live, people who are in this like middle class meetings oriented spaces are like, in the free commune, I will get to write the meeting agenda. And it's like, oh my Jesus fucking anyway. Like there's people who are acculturated and socialized into doing that. Like most people don't actually go to meetings ever. You know what I mean? Like most jobs don't involve meetings as like the form of sociality that people do. Like maybe like your shift lead is like lecturing you about how you fucked up last week and didn't meet like your sales quota or whatever. But like most people don't have meetings. Like white collar workers and students have things that are like the kinds of meetings that white collar workers and students make as like the entry point for their radical groups, right? So I think that just like the fetishization of process, right, I think is bad, right? I think doesn't mean we should never have meetings. Doesn't mean that I haven't hypocritically called or facilitated a few meetings of my own. But I think again, we just like elections, right? We need to be critical of the practices we're engaging in and encouraging people to engage in when they become litmus tests for achieving a thing and see if they're actually achieving the thing. Like I'm a big bully. Like the most important political conversations and ideas I've had are with people 30 minutes after meetings, right? Where you're like outside and you're like talking to someone, you have like a drink or a smoke or whatever, you're just like shooting the shit. And you're like, oh wait, that's a great fucking idea, right? So just I think that's something we need to keep in mind. That yeah, there's a fetishization I think of process and procedure, which has a role, but like um, I don't think that's what democracy in real terms looks like, right? I don't think it's like the Congress, but for everyone, or it's um, I think that oppositional grassroots political activity, um, in general, often involves a far greater degree of like decision making power for participants than we get from the American state for the simple reason that like if you don't feel like anyone's listening to you, why would you show up? Right? Like what's the buy-in if you aren't getting paid, if you don't have to be there, if you aren't getting anything materially from it, and you feel like no one gives a shit about what you say or what happens to you, like why would you even do that? Um, which I think is what we saw in some cities at the end of the George Floyd rebellion, right? When we had like reformist or authoritarian groups sort of setting the tone, setting the agenda. All you had at the end were people who were motivated, I think often by like white guilt, until that was no longer enough of an engine for people to like go do a useless thing again, right? And go on another permanent march and have someone else yell at me through a megaphone. Like people didn't have enough white guilt to sustain that for more than a few months. Um, but yeah, so I think that in these moments of like trying to figure out how to take this thing down, how to get things for ourselves and our communities, um, there is in the sense of building power, there often is a far more distributed um, decision making process. People have more voice. People have more chance to leave if they don't want to, and it incentivizes the creation of structures that are more democratic and more durable. And I think democracy, in that sense, that's the thing that I'm trying to. I wanted to excavate from this very broad concept. Um, I don't really give a shit about Robert's Rules of Orders. I don't care how good, like how beautifully designed a constitution is. I care like, do my neighbors get to have a say in what our neighborhood looks like in 5 years? Like, do for the people who are trying to take down a system that is exploitative and murderous, um, can we do that in such a way that we can like listen to each other and bring people in and figure out some way to do the thing together? Um, I think that's the thing that I still find uh, interesting about looking at the term democracy. I can't say that that's more democratic than democracy in any of these other senses, right? Because again, it's like it's a contested and very malleable term because it's become this like master narrative for legitimating virtually anything. But that's the way that I'm hoping that we can additionally think about it, um, as we prepare for what's going to happen in the years to come.
Yeah, I like, so, allow me to sort of geek out a little bit. I liked the way you ended this pamphlet because it sort of made me something dawned on me, which was surprising to me because I've been teaching like political philosophy for like more than 20 years or something. But you bring this lesson to me that was really stark, right? Is that when you look at all the sort of terms for different forms of government, right, like oligarchy, monarchy, right, there's a format to that which is right. There are the English words that are these combination of like ancient Greek terms, like oligarchy, right, is like archy is archon, ruler, a person who has power, dominating power. And then the oligarch, the olig part of that is like small group, usually the rich. So oligarchy is giving the rich the power to dominate. That's what oligarchy is. But then you point out very succinctly, democracy is doesn't use these terms, right? It doesn't have archy in it. Democracy is a different word, that demos, and then kratein or kratos, power, right? It's really people power. So democracy refers to a much different sort of system of thinking about how to organize society than any of these other kinds of terms. We're not talking about who gets to dominate. In democracy, we're talking about how do we organize people power? How do we get people power to be able to do things with their lives? And there's no mention of like, it's not demos archy, right? It's not like the people should dominate. It's rather how do we get people power? When you wrote that, I was like, oh, that's a totally different basis for thinking about this. So in this, right, if democracy doesn't mean like having processes and meetings where we sort of like build consensus for hours and hours, if that's not really the essence of it, I mean, what is democracy in terms of like people power, people accomplishing things? I mean, because you might get some sort of Marxist Leninist folks going out here and saying, well, that's what we mean. And in order to do that, we need democratic centralism. We need this small cadre of comrades. We're going to tell the people what they need to do to lead them to the promised land, and then they'll get what they want. I mean, how do we? So, if we were speaking from a certain kind of perspective about like democracy in real terms, does it rule out certain kinds of things, or does anything go in terms of building people power?
Yeah, I think something that's interesting about like it being democracy and not demarchy, right? It being not being an an arcos, like a form of like legitimate rule. Like monarchy is like there's one legitimate ruler. Oligarchy, like you said, there's like an elite, a smaller elite, where the few are the legitimate ruler. Um, in like ancient Greek political thought, like the people in the sense of like the demos weren't a legitimate political subject, so there couldn't be a demarchy. these are the people who are on the outside of the political system, or at least at its very edges. So the only thing that they can exercise is force, kratos, right? Um, it's like if we're thinking about doing like grounded, community rooted, militant organizing, like these are the people we, often are or are working alongside. People who are unhoused, people who are incarcerated, people who are undocumented, people who, by the norms of the American state, not only don't have um, like legitimate voice and interests, but kind of can't, or the system wouldn't make sense anymore, right? If undocumented people had the same voice as citizens, would there be a national state? If you got incarcerated, but you had the same rights and power as people who weren't incarcerated, what would the point of mass incarceration be? Why would you use that as a punishment anymore? If you weren't at risk of injury or death when you didn't pay rent and became unhoused, how would our housing market work? Right? It's not just the people in the sense of the majority, it's the people who, by the nature of their positionality, um, can only fight. The people who cannot structurally cannot be adequately represented or included into the political system and into the system of representation. Um, so if that's a long way away from thinking about the order of how people talk in meetings. But if that's how we're thinking of what part of the meaning of democracy is, um, it's also positional, right? Because I think, as you mentioned before, a lot of Americans can have terrible ideas, like the members of any polity. And I think by our nature as a genocidal slave empire historically, U.S. citizens are, socially predisposed to have terrible opinions as majority opinions. Like you mentioned, a majority of Americans are against transgender youth getting health care. Um, is that like is that good because in a majority rule sense it's democratic? Like if that's like the popular will, is that what we want? And like if that's what democracy is, why would we be committed to democracy? Like in November, 11 months into the Gaza genocide, 60% of US survey respondents favored continued military aid to Israel, right? And on this topic, to paraphrase a Greyhound bus driver who refused entry to an ICE agent in 2020, and I just want to say, I'm saying this as an ally, 60% on this topic, 60% of Americans can gargle my balls. Like, fuck those people. Um, that's not, like, I don't care. Like, if 90% of Americans want to carpet bomb hospitals, um, that's not any kind of democracy that any non-horrifying person should endorse, right? If 90% of Americans want trans kids to die, then 90% of Americans are wrong. Um, right? They like the thing that I think about when particularly white Americans get really into democracy is lynching, which was a feature of majority white towns, right? These were towns with white majorities. And everyone loved that shit. They would take their families out to have picnics as people got dismembered, and they bought pieces of their bodies as souvenirs. That was objectively democratic because it seems like everyone in these all white towns thought that was just great, right? Um, Screw every person in those all white towns at the murder picnic. Like all those people are monsters, right? And if that's anti-democratic, I don't give a shit. And no one should. And like, again, that's where our current U.S. political culture comes from. Like that's the direct antecedent. Like that was a normal American practice in the country that I live in today. Like that was folks' great grandparents did that. Um, like there's probably fucking fingers and shit in someone's like granny's storage locker right now. Um, and yeah, I don't care that everyone wanted to do that. Everyone was uh doing crimes against humanity. You know what I mean? Like, um,
Yeah, so I mean, from what I hear, what you're saying here is that so the way that we ought to think about democracy is not about like processes. It's not about whether or not there are various kinds of like institutional features in your government, but that thinking about democracy in real terms in this kind of radical sense means thinking very deeply about like the ethical, the moral commitments of the people who are on the margins of those kinds of systems. Like what's being done for people who are unhoused, who are being marginalized, oppressed, exploited in various kinds of ways. That what are we doing to empower them to have a voice? That's really what democracy is committed to in some sense. Is this what I'm hearing?
the only thing I would change is I don't think if we're thinking about the American political system, I don't think it's possible for some of us to have a voice structurally. I don't think it's possible for some communities and populations to have a voice. I think sometimes it's for like contingent reasons, like 70 years of investing in Israel as a client state of the US to like secure the Persian Gulf. I think sometimes it's like a like an inherent structural factor, right? Like undocumented incarcerated people necessarily not having the voice that an unincarcerated citizen would have. Um, I think it's about building force, building power, recognizing that we're in a fight, that our communities are in a fight, that our neighbors are in a fight, that we are in a fight. And we cannot let dreams of representation in a horrifying capitalist imperialist system distract us from the real concrete things that are actually important, making sure that we and our communities and our families and friends are able to survive and thrive, um, to make to decide what our lives and the lives of our loved ones are going to look like, and to organize ourselves not to be banging at the doors asking for admittance into this system that has hated us, that has always hated us, that has hated our ancestors and will hate our descendants, and is hated by the people of the world. And instead be organizing to tear these walls down.
I like that. Thank you. Final question just to think about this in thinking about democracy in real terms, in the sense of like the struggle, this fight to really just transform systems of representation to our whole sort of system of governance of the way that we think about society. Um, are there places that you think that we need to concentrate this fight today in terms of how we organize and resist efforts by the Trump administration? Are there sort of focus places you think that this fight really we should be paying attention to?
I think it's just really important to build with folks. I think something like everyone started caring about like immigrants from Latin America during the first Trump administration. Then Biden got in office, everyone was like, I don't give a shit anymore. And now people are like, I don't know. I see people like sharing these like know your rights if you ICE stops you things like citizens sharing them to their social networks who are all also like other citizens, and it's like I'm just like shout this at Spanish if I see a brown guy like getting stopped by ICE. It's like you got to build with folks. Like, if you want to be part of democratic resistance in the United States, not in the sense of the Democratic Party, like you actually got to be with people. Like you actually have to build and have relationships of like mutual understanding and solidarity with the folks who are not represented by this system. And if that's not where you're at for any number of reasons, like because of your social business, because we are geographically, whatever, like that's fine. Like, but like, I think we got to be real about that. Like, um, again, no matter what people's politics are, no matter what people's ideological inclinations are, no matter how good the politics of the podcasts people listen to are, we are existing in a deeply racist, deeply classist, deeply transphobic society, and that influences where we live, who we talk to, how we relate to folks, who we see as part of our community as someone like us, and who we see as someone other, either to like extend charity to or to ignore, right? Um, I think that we're at a really crucial time, and we've really passed an inflection point in the United States. Um, like the U.S. has never been particularly popular in many corners of the world, but it's really not doing great now in particular. Um, we're at an inflection point with the climate collapse. We're at an inflection point with the U.S. Ability to exert force and set global norms. I think we're at an inflection point with people's belief in the legitimacy of the political system. Not just on the left, but like in general. Like no one is really that invested at this point um, in like I don't know turnout for midterm elections or whatever. And like we need to understand this as a time of great risk and great potential. But we have to believe that we can win. We have to believe that we can actually get good shit for our communities and the people we care for. We have to believe that we can outlive empire. We have to believe that we can actually build force with the people who are on the edges and outside of this barbaric system, and organize to exert that force in a real way, not for representation, not for recognition, not for reforms, but to actually build something better um, within our lives because time is short. But we have seen, even in the US, though support for the Israeli genocide this is still a majority position among Americans, right? Um, there has been a watershed moment in people's understanding of the nature of uh, Israeli uh, colonization and oppression in the U.S. And people have seen shit and experienced shit that they can't unsee. Um, there has been, I think, a watershed moment in people's feeling comfortable expressing their feelings about the U.S. healthcare system because of something that happened last fall. I forget exactly what it was, but there was some news story, and all of a sudden you can say you hate healthcare CEOs now. I think like that is like there are things that like would not have been possible. I think for people to articulate like in the 90s, right? Anything less than full-throated support for like free market capitalism and like the Israeli state was like a wildly fringe position to a much greater extent than it is today. Um, we got to act like we can win because the far right is acting like it can win. The far right is acting like whatever fucking bullshit they want to build, the ethno state, some like weird trad Catholic theocracy, like whatever kind of bullshit different factions of the right are trying to build, they're actually acting like they could do it, like they could transform American society. Like obviously, um, these reactionary traditions have deep roots in the American system, but there is also a deep tradition of resistance in the United States. There's a deep tradition of resistance in many of the countries, a much more developed tradition of resistance in many of the countries people are emigrating from today. And like we need to orient ourselves politically as if we intend to actually win, to actually like just like the right is organizing to actually affect a transformation of American society. um, we need to organize to build the power to actually affect a transformation that will be beneficial for our people, that'll give us the kinds of self-determined, resourced, liberated communities that we need so desperately. Um, I have a strong belief that that is within the realm of possibility, um, which is why I'm saying all this like crazy radical shit 2 weeks into a neo-fascist presidency. Someone's going to put on the World Wide Web. But like we got to act like we can win it. Like we need to actually believe in, I think, the deeper, more profound sense of democracy that I've tried to articulate, as a way to build resistance, as a way to get our people what they need, as a way to survive and more. Um, yeah, or vote in the midterm elections, whatever you want. Choose your adventure. Both are good.
No, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate your time, and you're helping us to sort of unpack this pamphlet that you have written, "Democracy Beyond the State," that's available at anarchiststudies.org. We'll try to put that link down for people to have access to. But I want to thank you for a really fascinating conversation. Something that's I want to tell you, I've learned a lot from your writing in this short sense, and from speaking to you. So. I appreciate the work that you're doing and the enlightenment that you bring into organizers and thinking about what the struggle is ahead, but more importantly, also thinking about the hope that you're helping to establish. So appreciate you being here very much with us today.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, on if you go to the link, you can read the Democracy Beyond the State online. Hopefully, we get a printable version out soon, so you can paste it to the side of a Cybertruck. While you're on the website, you can check out my book, Define Displacement. You can also become a monthly sustainer to the Institute for Anarchist Studies to support this and other work. And I also have a Substack called In Struggle, that you can also subscribe to if you want to hear more of my ramblings.
Nice. Thank you. Appreciate it, Andrew Lee. Democracy Beyond the State is the name of the pamphlet. And thank you all for sticking with us and paying attention to what we're talking about. You can find us online at theNRAsproject.org, and we're all over the socials, including Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook, all over the place, really. Let us know what your thoughts are. Tell us what you have taken from this conversation about the radical roots of democratic practices for the struggles ahead. Thanks once again, Andrew.